She looked at me the way you look at furniture that arrived in the wrong color. Not anger, not irritation, just indifference, the kind that doesn't even bother to hide itself, because why would it? I was a human. I was a treaty clause with legs. I was, as far as Princess Valeth of the Solhari Imperium was concerned, a mildly inconvenient decoration that the rules of galactic diplomacy required her to drag across 11 days of deep space travel, like a piece of luggage she hadn't packed herself. My name is Davin Reyes. I am 31 years old. I have been a soldier for 9 years, a special forces operator for 5, and for the last 6 hours I have been standing in a ceremonial robe that someone handed me without a word, aboard a Solhari royal transport ship, watching the most politically important woman in the known galaxy pretend I do not exist. I will be honest with you. I have had worse assignments. The briefing, 2 days earlier on Terran Orbital Station 7, had lasted exactly 22 minutes. My commanding officer, Colonel Harlan Price, had told me I would be escorting Princess Valeth to the Galactic Summit on Kethafi. He had said the word escort the way you say the word dentist. Necessary, unpleasant, and best gotten over with quickly. The summit was a diplomatic gathering of 12 species, held every 4 years, and the 200-year-old Terran Solhari Treaty required a human presence at any event attended by the Solhari royal family. It was an old rule. Nobody remembered why it existed. Nobody had ever made it mean anything. I was going to be that human presence. I was going to stand near the princess, wear the robe, keep my mouth shut, and come home after 11 days. Simple. Colonel Price had called it a ribbon cutting with legs. He had smiled when he said it. I had not smiled back, because I was already reading the secondary briefing notes on my tablet, the ones he hadn't asked me to read, and I had found 3 things that made the smile feel wrong. The first thing was the Veth separatist movement. They had been active for 8 months, operating in the same transit corridors the royal transport would use. They wanted Solhari territory. They wanted it badly enough to have already ended 3 diplomatic convoys in the past year. The official assessment called them a minor regional threat. I had worked with official assessments before. I had also worked in the field, and those 2 things are not always the same. The second thing was the princess's security detail. Commander Ross led its 6 personal guards, all Solhari military elite, all trained under a doctrine so precisely structured that you could set a clock by their patrol rotations. That level of precision is impressive until it becomes predictable. Then it becomes a door left unlocked. The third thing was me. Specifically, the fact that I had been assigned alone. 1 human soldier, classified as ceremonial, without weapons clearance beyond a standard sidearm, and carrying a security rating that the Solhari would not even bother to read, because they had already decided it didn't matter. I thought about those 3 things for a long time. Then I packed my bag. The royal transport was called the Vel Sarath. In Solhari, that meant something like unbroken light. It was enormous and beautiful and designed to communicate power at every angle. The hull was pale gold with bioluminescent trim that pulsed in slow rhythmic waves. The corridors inside were wide enough for 3 Solhari to walk side by side, which meant they were just slightly too wide to feel comfortable for a human. A reminder, subtle but constant, that this was not your ship, not your space, not your world. The Chamberlain's name was Orveth. He was tall, thin, and had the permanent expression of someone who has been managing minor crises for so long that he no longer reacts to them. He simply processes them and moves on. He met me at the docking port, handed me the robe, and said, in perfectly functional Terran standard, that I was not to speak unless addressed, that I was not to initiate conversation with members of the court, that I was not to approach the princess within 4 body lengths unless she indicated otherwise, and that meals would be delivered to me quarters at the standard Terran nutritional schedule. I thanked him. He had already turned and walked away. My quarters were small but clean. I put the robe on a hook and did not touch it again for 3 hours. Instead, I walked the ship. I want to be clear about something. I did not walk the ship because I had been told to. I walked it because I cannot help it. 9 years of military service does something permanent to the way your brain processes space. Every room I enter, I clock the exits. Every corridor I walk, I mark the distances. I do not do this consciously anymore. It happens the way breathing happens, underneath everything else, constant and automatic. My unit used to joke that I could fall asleep in a combat zone and wake up knowing where every door was. That was almost true. The Vel Sarath had 6 main passenger decks, 2 engineering decks below, a medical bay, a communications hub, and a series of maintenance corridors running between the walls like the veins inside a leaf. The maintenance corridors were not on the public map. I found them anyway, because maintenance access hatches have a particular kind of seal that leaves a faint pressure mark on the wall panel beside them. And once you know what to look for, you see them everywhere. I walked those corridors for 2 hours. I memorized every junction, every hatch, every ventilation shaft wide enough for a person to move through. I counted the steps between the princess's chamber and the nearest maintenance access. I noted that the ship's internal sensor grid had a blind spot, a gap between two overlapping fields, that lasted approximately 90 seconds during each power rerouting cycle, which happened every 4 hours on the dot. When I came back to my quarters, I sat on the edge of the bed and thought about the cargo manifest discrepancy I had noticed at the docking port. One container of maintenance supplies had been logged twice, once at the loading bay and once at an internal storage point. That kind of error happens all the time. Probably it was nothing. But probably is not the same as certainly, and I had learned a long time ago that the difference between those two words is where most bad things live. I also thought about the maintenance technician I had seen near the engineering access on Deck 4. His uniform was clean, too clean for someone who had been working a transit shift. His tools were clipped to his belt in the right order. His posture was correct. Everything about him was correct, and that was the problem. People who actually do maintenance jobs develop small inefficiencies over time. A clip worn at a slightly wrong angle from being opened 1,000 times. A smudge that didn't wash out completely. The lived-in quality of a job that belongs to you. This man had none of that. He looked like someone who had studied how to look like a maintenance technician, and had done it very well, and had not quite understood that doing it very well was itself the mistake. I filed all of that away and went to the welcome reception. Princess Valeth entered the reception hall as if the room had been built around her, which in a sense it had. She was tall even by Solhari standards, with the pale silver bioluminescence that marked the imperial bloodline, and 4 upper limbs that moved with the kind of controlled grace that only comes from years of deliberate practice. She wore a formal court robe in deep blue with gold trim, and she moved through the assembled guests with the quiet efficiency of someone who has been performing this particular act since childhood, and has long since stopped needing to think about it. She did not look at me when she passed. I was standing 3 steps behind her chamberlain, in the correct position, wearing the robe, doing exactly what I had been told to do. She passed within 2 meters of me, and her gaze moved across the room without pausing. I did not take it personally. I was watching the room. There were 43 people in the reception hall, not counting staff. I knew the security roles of 8 of them. I did not know the roles of 4 others, which bothered me more than any of the ones I did know. 2 of those 4 were standing near the far wall in positions that gave them sight lines to all 3 exits. The third was talking to a Solhari court official, with the easy confidence of someone very comfortable in social situations, which is a quality found equally in diplomats and in people who do not want to be noticed. The fourth was the clean maintenance technician from Deck 4, who was now wearing a server's uniform and carrying a tray of drinks. That was when I stopped thinking about probably and started thinking about certainly. The reception ended. The ship moved into its transit corridor. The stars outside the viewports became long pale lines and then disappeared into the deep nothing of corridor space. Valeth retired to her chambers. The court settled into the rhythms of an 11-day journey. Commander Ross's guards ran their precise clockwork patrol rotations. Everything was quiet and orderly and exactly as it was supposed to be. I moved my sleeping position from the bed in my quarters to the floor of the corridor outside the princess's chamber. I put my back against the wall, angled so I could see both the corridor junction and the maintenance hatch I had identified 3 meters to my left. I set my internal clock for 2-hour intervals. I kept my sidearm positioned where Solhari scanners would read it as biological material, because the ceramic composite it was made of has a molecular density that most non-Terran sensor systems classify as soft tissue. I closed my eyes, but I did not sleep deeply. I never do in spaces I don't fully trust. 4 days later, the ship went quiet in all the wrong ways, and everything I had been waiting for began. The layover on Keth Station was supposed to last 6 hours. We docked at 0800 station time. The official schedule called for a fuel and supply refresh, a small diplomatic courtesy meeting with the station commander, and a chance for the court to stretch their legs in the station's upper promenade. Simple, unremarkable. The kind of stop that gets logged as a footnote in the mission record and forgotten. I used those 6 hours like a second job. The station's upper promenade was elegant, designed for species with money and time. Long curved walkways overlooked a central atrium full of vendor stalls, rest alcoves, and the particular kind of controlled beauty that exists in places built to make powerful people feel comfortable. The court spread out naturally. moving in small clusters, browsing vendors, exchanging pleasantries with station personnel who had clearly been briefed to be very pleasant indeed. I lasted 11 minutes in the promenade. Then I told the Chamberlain Orvith that I needed to use a Terran-compatible nutrition facility, which was true, and which also happened to require me to walk through the station's lower service corridor to reach the nearest compatible unit, which was also true, and which also happened to take me past Docking Bay 7, which was where I needed to go. I had spotted the problem at 0814, 6 minutes after we docked. The Vel Sereth had pulled into Bay 12. Bay 7, 3 bays down, had a mid-range courier vessel sitting quiet with its loading ramp down and no crew visible. Ships with their ramps down and no crew visible are either abandoned or waiting. Abandoned ships get flagged by station maintenance within the hour. This one had been sitting for at least 2 days, judging by the dust accumulation on the ramp edge, and nobody had flagged it. That meant either station maintenance was very bad at its job, or someone had made sure the flag didn't happen. I walked past Bay 7 twice. The second time, I was eating a nutrition bar and looking at nothing in particular, and I counted 6 distinct boot prints in the dust near the ramp. Different tread patterns, different sizes, all pointing inward. No prints pointing out. Whatever had come off that ship had not gone back to it. 6 people, possibly more. I kept walking. I found the nutrition facility, used it, bought 2 packets of Terran ground coffee from the vending unit beside it. Real ground coffee, the compressed kind that keeps for 6 months, and went looking for a dock worker named whoever was willing to talk to me in exchange for something worth talking for. His name was Garrett Cole. He was 26 years old, human, and he had been working freight intake on Keth Station for 3 years. He was eating lunch alone at a small table near the cargo processing bay, when I sat down across from him and put one of the coffee packets on the table between us. He looked at it. He looked at me. He said, "That's the real kind." I said it was. He said, "What do you want to know?" I told him I was curious about the courier vessel in Bay 7. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the bay had been booked under a maintenance hold 3 days ago. Paid in advance. Station records showed an ongoing mechanical issue with the ship's nav array. He said the crew had come through cargo processing with equipment cases, logged as personal effects. No inspection flagged because the booking credentials were clean. He said 6 people, maybe 7. He hadn't looked too closely because the credentials were clean and that was usually enough. I asked him what the equipment cases looked like. He said they were long, about 1.5 meters. He said he saw them once and then they were gone, processed through and logged, and he didn't think much about it at the time. Long cases, 1.5 meters. I knew what fit in a case that size. I thanked Garrett Cole. But I told him to stay out of the lower decks for the rest of the day if he could manage it. He looked at me for a moment, and I think he understood more than I said, because he nodded once and pocketed the coffee without another word. I went back to the upper promenade. Commander Ross was easy to find. He was standing at the edge of the main walkway with 2 of his guards, watching the court with the focused alertness of a man who took his job seriously. I respected that. I walked up to him directly, which was already a violation of the protocol Orvith had explained, but I decided protocol could wait. I told him what I had found, the courier vessel, the 6 sets of boot prints, the long cases, the connection to the Veth separatist activity in this transit corridor, which I had read in the secondary briefing notes, and which Ross absolutely also knew about. He listened. He was polite about it. He was so polite that I could see, behind the politeness, exactly how much weight he was giving my words, which was very little, measured in units of very little, arranged neatly in a very small box. He told me the station had been swept by Solhari security teams before our arrival. He told me the intelligence channels were clear. He told me that human threat assessment protocols were not calibrated for Solhari diplomatic contexts, and that he appreciated my vigilance, and that I could return to my assigned position. I stood there for a moment. I said, "Commander, the sweep was done before our arrival. If someone booked that bay 3 days ago and brought their people in after the sweep," he said. "Thank you, Sergeant Reyes." That was the end of the conversation. I turned around, and that was when I noticed her. Valeth was standing 20 meters away, beside a vendor selling decorative star maps. She was not looking at the maps. She was looking at me. Not past me, not through me, at me directly, with an expression I had not seen on her face before. It was not warmth. It was not sympathy. It was the expression of a person recalibrating. Like she had put a number into an equation and gotten a result that didn't match the formula, and she was deciding whether the formula was wrong or the number was. Then someone from her court said something to her and she turned away, and she was the princess again. Composed, distant, in motion, untouchable. I went back to thinking about the 6 people who had walked off that ship and not come back. The rest of the layover was calm. The courtesy meeting with the station commander lasted 40 minutes. The court shopped and rested and ate. 2 of Valeth's attendants, a young woman named Clara and an older one named Pris, stopped to look at the same star map vendor I had seen the princess standing near. I walked past them without stopping, but I heard Clara say something that made me pause a half step. She said she had seen one of the station crew near the princess's temporary restroom twice in 1 hour, which was odd because the restroom was at the end of a corridor with nothing else in it. I asked Clara casually what he looked like. She described the clean maintenance technician from Deck 4 of the Velserath, the one with the too perfect uniform and the tools in the wrong kind of order. He was wearing different clothes now, but Clara had a good eye for faces. So he was not a maintenance technician at all. He was here already, on station, before we docked, which meant he had come off the courier vessel in Bay 7, which meant he was the advanced scout, and the 6 who had walked those boots into the station were his team, and they were here to gather information and then return to the Velserath in some other form. Return how? I thought about for the rest of the layover. I thought about it while I went back to the ship. I thought about it while we undocked and moved back into the transit corridor, and the stars went strange outside the viewports again. I went back to my spot on the floor outside the princess's chamber. I relaced my boots the specific way I always do before I expect to need to move fast. I moved my sidearm to the secondary position along my left side, under the robe, where it would draw cleanly without catching fabric. I opened and closed my right hand 3 times to check the cut on my palm from the maintenance hatch handle earlier. It sealed fine. Nothing that would affect grip. Then I thought about the cargo manifest. The one that had logged a maintenance supply container twice. Once at loading, once at an internal point. I had been thinking of it as a clerical error. Now I was thinking about it differently. A container large enough for supplies could fit a person, or 2 people, if the people were willing to be uncomfortable. A double log entry could mean the container moved from external loading to internal storage without being opened or inspected. Because it was already in the system, and the system said it was supplies, and nobody checks supplies twice. 6 sets of boot prints had gone into the station. I had counted the same maintenance technician, the same technician from the ship, plus whoever else had followed. If some of them had come back aboard in a supply container, if the number was not 6 on the outside looking in, but 12 total, split between the approach and the infiltration, then the sweep Commander Ross trusted so completely was already irrelevant. I pulled out my small field tablet. I opened the ship's accessible manifest, the public-facing portion, not the security layer, and found the supply container entry. It had been logged into internal storage on Deck 3. Deck 3 was 2 decks above engineering and 1 deck below the passenger quarters. It was also, I noted, exactly adjacent to a maintenance junction that connected to every major corridor on the ship. I sat with that information for a long time. Then I wrote a short message to Colonel Price. I told him what I had found. I told him my assessment. I told him the threat level was not minor, and the timeline was short, and I needed either immediate backup or clearance to act on my own judgment. The message would take 4 hours to reach Orbital Station 7 through the transit corridor relay. By the time he read it, whatever was going to happen would already be happening. I knew that. I sent the message anyway, because the record matters. And then I put the tablet away and sat back against the wall outside the princess's chamber and listened to the ship breathe around me. The hum of the engines, the soft cycle of the ventilation, the distant footsteps of the night patrol running their clockwork rotations. Somewhere below me, in a supply container on Deck 3, I believed there were people waiting. They were patient. They had planned this carefully. They had credentials and timing and inside knowledge of the patrol rotations, which meant someone on this ship or in this court had given them what they needed. They had every advantage. What they did not have was the 90-second sensor window I had found on my first day. What they did not have was the maintenance corridor map in my head. What they did not have was the understanding that the human guarding this door was not decoration. He had never been decoration. He had just been waiting for them to believe it long enough to matter. I closed my eyes. I did not sleep. I counted my breath and I waited. On the 4th night, at ZO214 I heard it. A sound in the subsonic range, just below what most species register consciously. A flat, canceling frequency, the kind that active comm jammers produce when they engage. I was already standing before I understood I had moved. I checked the corridor. Empty. The patrol guard who should have been at the junction was not there. His rotation was not due to change for another 20 minutes. He was either redirected or down. From below me, very faint, came the sound of a hatch being unsealed from the inside. I moved to the wall beside the maintenance access hatch, 3 meters from the princess's door. I kept myself flat against the wall, out of the opening arc. I kept my breathing slow. I kept my hands still. The hatch opened. The first one through was fast and quiet, and moved like someone with training. He turned left, which was the direction of the patrol junction. He did not turn right, which was the direction of the princess's door. That told me the plan was to clear the patrol first and then come back for the door, which meant there was a second one right behind him. I let the first one turn left. I took the second one as he cleared the hatch. Before he had time to orient, no sound. Fast, down. The first one heard nothing. The sound of the ventilation covered everything, and moved toward the patrol junction. I followed him. I know that sounds strange, moving toward a threat rather than guarding the door. But the door had a lock rated for 4 minutes of sustained forced entry, and I had 30 seconds before the first one reached the patrol and realized the patrol guard was not there, and came back with questions. 30 seconds was enough, more than enough. It was over in 8 seconds. I pulled both of them into the maintenance corridor and sealed the hatch behind me from the inside. Then I came back out through the hatch 11 meters down the corridor, the one I had mapped on day 1, and I moved back toward the princess's door. 2 more were coming from the main corridor. They were moving fast, and they were not being quiet anymore, which meant they were past the stealth phase and into the execution phase, which meant the timeline had accelerated, which meant there were others already moving elsewhere on the ship. I did not think about the others. I thought about these 2. They saw me at the same moment I saw them. There was a half second where all 3 of us were still, the way things go still right at the edge of something. Then they came forward, because they had distance and weapons and numbers, and there was only one of me, and I was soft and small and human, and they had been briefed on Solhari guards, and this was neither. The half second was all I needed. They had expected retreat. That is the thing most trained soldiers expect from a target in an open corridor. You move back, you create distance, you draw them toward a choke point. I did not retreat. I moved forward, into the gap between them, inside both their weapons at the same moment. And the fight was ugly and short and ended the way those fights always end when someone makes the wrong assumption about how a human responds to being outnumbered. When it was over, I straightened up. My ribs ached on the right side. One of them had gotten a solid contact before I ended it. I breathed through it. I checked the corridor both ways. I listened. The princess's door opened. Valeth stood in the doorway. She was fully dressed, which told me she had not been sleeping, which told me she had been aware that something was wrong even before the sounds in the corridor. She looked at the 4 figures on the floor. She looked at me. Her face was completely still, the way very controlled people go still, when something has bypassed every category they had ready for it. I held up one hand toward her. Don't come out yet, without looking away from the corridor. She stood there for a moment. Then she stepped back inside and closed the door halfway, keeping it open just enough to see. She did not obey because I outranked her. She did not obey because she was afraid. She obeyed because in that moment, I was the person in the corridor who understood what was happening, and some part of her recognized that understanding and responded to it. That was the first time she had ever done anything I indicated without processing it first. I filed that away and listened to the ship. There were 8 more of them somewhere in the dark. I could hear, very faintly through the walls, the sound of boots on deck plating moving in coordinated patterns. They were spreading out. They had a plan, and the plan was still running, and I was the only thing between it and the woman behind that half-open door. I moved to the maintenance hatch. I opened it. I looked back at the door and held up 2 fingers, then pointed inward. Come with me, stay close. Then I pointed to the hatch. Valeth looked at the maintenance hatch. She looked at me. She walked across the corridor, ducked her head. She was very tall, and the hatch was not designed for Solhari dimensions, and moved into the dark. I went in behind her and sealed the hatch shut, and the darkness swallowed us both. And somewhere behind the walls of the Vel Sarath, 8 people were still moving, still searching, still running a plan that had not yet accounted for the possibility that the decoration was not decorative. They would find out soon. The maintenance corridors of the Vel Sarath were not built for 2 people moving in a hurry. They were built for 1 maintenance technician moving slowly, checking panels, replacing components, doing the quiet, unglamorous work that keeps a ship alive. The ceiling was low, the walls were close. Every few meters there was a pipe junction, or a cable housing that you had to angle around, and the light was the dim amber of emergency auxiliary power. which cast everything in a color that made the shadows look deeper than they were. Valeth moved behind me without a sound. I will say that for her, she was quiet. She did not ask where we were going. She did not ask what was happening. She kept 2 steps behind me, and she kept her head down and she moved. And that told me more about her than anything I had observed in the previous 4 days. I knew where I was going. That was the only thing that mattered right now. The maintenance network connected 4 major junctions, 1 near engineering, 1 near the bridge, 1 near the med bay, and 1 near the cargo level. The cargo level junction was the lowest point on the network, and the furthest from the areas the attackers were moving through. It was also adjacent to an emergency power coupling that, if I accessed it correctly, would let me send a single short-range signal to the bridge. Not a full communication, just a pulse, the kind that Solhari bridge systems would recognize as a distress indicator and route to Commander Ross. Ross had not listened to me at the station. He would listen to a distress indicator from his own ship's system. But first I had to get there, without running into the 8 remaining attackers. And to do that, I needed to know where they were. I stopped at the first junction and pressed my ear to the wall panel on the left side. The Velsereth's walls were a composite material, strong, light, and incidentally very good at transmitting vibration across short distances if you knew how to listen. My unit had used this property in field operations more times than I could count, pressing hands or ears to walls and structures where the comm was down, reading the movement of people through the tremor in the material. 3 sets of footsteps, moving fast, on the deck above us, moving toward the passenger quarters level. They had found the 4 I had left in the corridor, and they knew the princess was not in her room. They were spreading the search wider. 2 more sets of footsteps, slower, on the same level as us, moving toward the cargo junction from the other direction. That was the problem. They were going to reach the cargo junction before me if I moved straight. I needed to not move straight. I turned to Valeth. In the amber half-dark, her bioluminescent markings were very faint. She was suppressing them deliberately, I realized, which was a conscious act for a Solhari, the equivalent of a human controlling their breathing. She was managing herself. Under pressure, in the dark, in a maintenance corridor she had never been in before, she was managing herself well. I held up 2 fingers and pointed down the right branch of the junction. Then I held up 2 more fingers and pointed left. Then I pointed to myself and then right, and to her and then left, and I mimed the motion of making noise, a tap, a scratch, something that would carry through the wall. She looked at me for a moment, then she nodded once. I moved right, she moved left. I heard her, 30 seconds later, produce a sound against the wall panel that was precise and deliberate, a short rhythm, like something working loose, something a maintenance system might generate, something that would make 2 people moving through a corridor pause and recalibrate their position. They paused. I heard it in the wall. The footsteps stopped for 4 seconds. 4 seconds was enough. I came through the side hatch into the corridor. At the moment they were both looking toward the sound. The engagement was short. The corridor was narrow, which removed the advantage of numbers, and I was already moving at the moment I came through the hatch, which removed the advantage of surprise. What I had instead was the specific kind of efficiency that comes from years of close-quarters training applied in a space so small that large movements are impossible and everything has to be precise. 2 down, 6 remaining. I went back to the junction and collected Valeth, and we moved deeper into the network. She had 2 attendants, Clara and Pris, the ones I had spoken to briefly at the station's star map vendor. They had been in Valeth's chamber when everything started. I had told them to stay in the chamber and lock the door, and they had done that. But the door was not rated for sustained forced entry, and with 6 people still searching the ship, I could not leave them in a room that would eventually be found. At the next junction I stopped and counted my options. The attendants were 2 decks above us. The attackers above were moving in a pattern that would bring them past that chamber within 8 to 10 minutes. The cargo junction was still 3 minutes ahead of us. The distress signal was at the cargo junction. I looked at Valeth. I said quietly, "Your attendants are above us. I need 2 minutes to reach them and bring them down here. I need you to stay at this junction, stay silent, and if anything moves in either corridor that is not me, you press yourself into the wall and do not move," she said. "And if something does move and is not you," I said, "then I was not fast enough and you run for the cargo level and look for a panel marked with 2 red lines. Press it 3 times. It will send a signal to the bridge," she said. 2 red lines. 3 times, I said yes. She looked at me steadily. "How do you know this ship better than its own crew?" I said. "I walked it." She said, "For how long?" I said, "The first 2 days." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Go get my attendants." I went. The 2 decks felt very long. I moved up through the maintenance shafts as fast as the space allowed, counting junctions, keeping track of the footsteps in the walls. 2 of the 3 sets I had tracked above were closer now, moving toward the chamber level. I was going to have very little time. The hatch nearest to the attendant's position came out in a service alcove behind a storage panel, 3 meters from the chamber door. I came out of it, checked the corridor, clear, and reached the door in 4 steps. I tapped the specific pattern on the door panel that I had established with Clara and Pris when I told them to lock it. 3 short, 2 long. The door opened. Clara's face appeared. She was scared, but she was functional, which was what I needed. Prize was behind her, holding a small emergency light bar like it was a weapon, which made me like her immediately. I said quiet and quick, "Follow me." They followed me. We were in the maintenance shaft heading back down when I heard the footsteps change. Above us now, directly above, and then the sound of a door being tested. They had reached the chamber. I moved faster. Clara kept pace without being told. Prize, older and slightly less mobile in the narrow shaft, was breathing harder but not stopping. I set the pace at the fastest she could match and held it exactly. We reached the junction where I had left Vaelith. She was exactly where I had told her to be, pressed to the wall still, not a movement or a sound. Her eyes found mine in the amber light, and something in her face shifted very slightly, the way a calculation shifts when a new number comes in. Clara made a short, involuntary sound of relief when she saw the princess. Vaelith touched Clara's arm once, brief, firm, a kind of wordless acknowledgement, and then looked at me again. Ready. We moved for the cargo junction. 3 minutes felt longer than 3 minutes. I marked every sound in the walls, every shift in the footstep patterns above us. One set was moving fast and purposeful, which meant they had found the chamber empty and were reassessing. Another set had gone quiet, which was worse, because quiet meant they were waiting rather than searching, which meant they had guessed at a route. The cargo junction appeared at the end of a long, narrow passage. I saw it before we reached it, and I also saw, at the same moment, the figure at the far end of the passage, coming from the opposite direction. He had a weapon drawn. He saw us at the same moment I saw him. I said very quietly to Vaelith, "Stop." I walked forward alone. He raised the weapon. I kept walking. Not because I was unafraid. I want to be precise about this, but because stopping would give him time to settle his aim and adjust his stance, and moving toward him would give me the opposite of both those things, and would also be the last thing he expected. Because in every tactical doctrine in the known galaxy, the standard response to a leveled weapon is to stop or to retreat, and I was doing neither. I was 6 steps away when he fired. I was already moving laterally. The shot passed my right shoulder and hit the wall. I was 4 steps away, then 2, then none. The weapon did not fire a second time. I picked it up from the floor and checked its charge. It had 4 more in the cell. I kept it. Behind me I heard Vaelith exhale. A single, controlled release of breath, the sound of someone who had been holding absolutely still and had now allowed themselves to breathe. I reached the cargo junction, found the panel with the 2 red lines, pressed it 3 times. The distress pulse went out. It would reach the bridge in 11 seconds. Above us, I heard the ship's internal alarm begin. Not the loud general alarm, but the command alert. The one that goes directly to the bridge and security detail. Then I heard Commander Ross's voice through the wall intercoms, muffled but audible, beginning to organize his response. Help was coming. But it was coming from the bridge level, and we were at the cargo level, and between those 2 points, 5 people were still moving through this ship. They knew their timeline had collapsed. That meant they were going to move faster and care less about being quiet. I looked at Vaelith. I looked at Clara and Pris. I said, "We stay here until Ross reaches Deck 3. That is the fastest safe route. It will take about 6 minutes. Clara said, 6 Pris, still holding her emergency light bar, said, "What do we do for 6 minutes?" I said. "We make it very difficult for anyone to come through that hatch." And we did. The first one came through 4 minutes in. He did not get far. The second one came 3 minutes after the first, by which time Ross and 2 of his guards had reached Deck 3, and the sound of them moving through the ship was enough to change the calculus for the remaining attackers, who were now caught between the cargo level and the bridge level, with nowhere clean to go. One of them ran toward the cargo level, which was toward us. He was the 5th that night. He also was not the last. That came later, in a corridor near engineering, with the ship's distress signal still pulsing and Ross still 2 decks above us, and me running on adrenaline and a cracked rib, and the particular narrow focus that the human body produces when it has been in a high-threat state for long, enough that fear stops being a feeling and becomes a kind of fuel. But that is not this moment. This moment, in the dim amber light of the cargo junction, Valeth looked at me and said something I did not expect. She said, "How long have you been sleeping in the corridor outside my door?" I said, "Since the first night." She said, "I knew. I saw the scuff marks on the wall where you put your back." She paused. I thought it was strange. I did not say anything. I said, "Why not?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I did not know what to do with it." I nodded. I understood that. There are things that don't fit your model of the world, and until you know what category they belong to, sometimes the only thing you can do is wait and see. She had waited. She was seeing. We waited out the 6 minutes. Ross came down from deck 3 with 4 guards. He looked at the 4 people I had left in the lower corridors. He looked at the weapon in my hand. He looked at me. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "The bridge has been secured. We have 3 in custody. 2 are unaccounted for." I said, "Engineering accesses. Deck 2, the south junction." He looked at me. "How do you know that?" I said. "Because if I were them, that's where I would go." He sent 2 guards. They came back 11 minutes later. The 2 were accounted for. That left the team leader and his second, who had not come through the network at all. They were somewhere else, holding a position I had not yet placed. I thought about that while the ship buzzed with the controlled chaos of a security response, and Ross organized his people, and Clara and Pris stayed close to Valeth in a tight and quiet cluster. Valeth herself stood slightly apart from all of it, watching me think, with the expression of someone who has finally figured out what category something belongs to, and is not quite ready to say it out loud yet. I gave her the time. We both had other things to manage first. When the immediate chaos settled, and Ross had his people positioned and the captured attackers were secured in the ship's holding space, I took stock. 12 had entered the ship. I was certain of 12 because of the 2 supply container entries and the 6 from the station, and because they captured 3 when Ross interrogated them on the bridge. I was not in the room, but I was listening through the wall, and yes, I am aware of how that sounds. Confirmed a team of 12. 8 were down or captured. 2 had been taken by Ross's guards in the engineering junction. That left 2 unaccounted for. The team leader and whoever worked closest to him. I moved Valeth, Clara, and Pris to a secondary maintenance alcove 2 junctions off the main cargo corridor. It was a small space, awkward, with exposed pipe housing on one wall. But it had 2 access points and no blind corners, and I could hear both corridors leading to it clearly. I told them to stay quiet and stay low. Pris sat down on the floor without complaint. Clara stayed standing, watching the hatch. Valeth stood against the far wall with her arms loosely at her sides and looked at me. I was checking the weapon I had taken. 4 charges remaining. I also had my own sidearm, still at the secondary position under the robe, with a full cell. The cracked rib on my right side had settled from sharp to dull, which was fine. Dull I could work with. The cut on my forearm from earlier in the night had sealed but was pulling when I raised my arm above my shoulder. I kept my raises below shoulder height. Valeth said quietly, "You are hurt." She said, "How badly?" I said, "Not badly enough to matter right now." She looked at me for a moment. "Is that a Terran military standard? Not badly enough to matter right now?" I said, "Something like that." She said, "We have a similar concept in the Solhari court. We call it the presentation threshold. The point at which a weakness becomes visible enough to affect your standing. Before that threshold, you do not acknowledge it." I said, "That's not exactly the same thing." She said, "No. What you mean is that the function still works, so the damage is irrelevant. We mean that others cannot see it, so it does not exist yet." I looked at her. She looked at me. I said, "Which do you think is more useful?" She considered that with what appeared to be genuine seriousness. "Yours," she said, "obviously." In the corridor outside, something moved. I went still. Clara pressed back against the wall. Pris on the floor did not move at all. She had excellent instincts. Valeth, without being told, took 2 slow, silent steps to the left and put a pipe housing between herself and the hatch. The sound did not come again. Whatever had made it had stopped or changed direction. I waited 40 seconds. Nothing. I let my breath out slowly. Valeth stepped back to her original position. I said, "At the station. When you heard me talking to Commander Ross, how much did you understand?" She said, "All of it." "I speak Terran Standard." I said, "Ross didn't mention that." She said, "Ross does not know. My language certifications are not in the public record. It is useful for a diplomat to be able to hear what people say when they believe she cannot understand them." I said, "That's a good strategy." She said, "You used a similar one. You understood everything my court said about you. None of them knew you had the implant translation." I had not told her that. I looked at her. She said, "You never reacted to the insults, not once, not even a flicker. That is either remarkable self-control or complete comprehension. Someone who has already processed the information and filed it as irrelevant. Given what I have seen of you since, I believe it was the second. I said, does it bother you that I heard? She thought about no, she said. It bothers me that they said it. That is a different problem. She paused. I did not think you were worthless. I thought you were unnecessary, which is different. I said, I understand the difference. She said, I know you do. A pause. I was wrong. I did not make anything of that. It was information, and I filed it the same way I filed everything, cleanly, without attaching weight to it that it hadn't earned yet. But I noticed it. I am always noticing things. I said, the two remaining, the team leader and his second, they are not running. If they were running, they would have found an escape route when Ross secured the bridge. The ship's emergency pods are on deck 1. They had time to reach them. They did not. Valeth said, so they are still here intentionally. I said yes, which means the mission is still active, which means they believe they can still complete it. She said, with 10 of their team gone. I said, 2 very good people can complete a mission that 12 average people could not. It depends on what the mission actually requires. She was quiet for a moment. You think one of them is the person who provided the patrol rotations? The inside source said yes. She said, someone in my court. I said, or the crew, but more likely the court, because the patrol rotation information is not distributed to crew. Only the court and the personal security detail have access. Her face did not change. She was very good at that. But something behind her eyes shifted, not fear, something colder and more controlled than fear. The calculation of someone who has just confirmed a suspicion she had been hoping was wrong. She said, the mission. What is the completion condition? I said, you. She said, alive or not? I said, I do not know which. She nodded. She processed that. She said, what do we do? I said, we move to engineering. Ross is controlling the upper decks, but the lower decks are still soft. If the team leader knows where we are, and the inside source may be telling him, this alcove becomes a trap. Moving creates uncertainty about our position. She said, and engineering gives us what? I said, communications. The main jam is tied to a relay on the engineering deck. If I can reach the relay and cut the power coupling, the jam drops, and we can contact the summit ships in the transit corridor. That changes the situation, she said. How long to reach engineering from here? I said, 4 minutes if the route is clear. Less if I move fast alone, she said. You are not moving alone, I said, Your Highness. She said you need people who can move quietly and follow instructions exactly. Clara and Pris have both demonstrated that. And you need someone at the communications panel who has Solhari Summit override codes because the summit ships will not accept a signal without authentication. She looked at me. I have those codes. I had not thought about the authentication. I thought about it now for about 2 seconds. Then I said, all right. She said, good, tell us the route. I told them the route. Clara repeated it back to me accurately. Prize stood up from the floor and handed me back the emergency light bar she had been holding, because she no longer needed it now that we were moving. I took it and clipped it to my belt. You never waste a tool. We moved through the maintenance network in a line, Valeth second, Clara last, Pris third. I set the pace and I did not slow down. My rib was making itself known every time I twisted to check a junction, but twisting was faster than stopping, so I twisted. The engineering access hatch was at the end of a long horizontal passage. I could hear through the wall the sound of the engineering space beyond it, the deeper hum of the drive systems, the recycler cycling, the particular resonance of an active power coupling. I also heard, beneath those sounds, breathing. 2 sets, very controlled, very patient. They were inside engineering, positioned on either side of the interior door. They had gotten there before us, and they were waiting. They had either guessed the route or been told it, and it did not matter which. The result was the same. I held up a fist. Everyone stopped. I pressed my back against the wall and thought for exactly 3 seconds. Then I turned to Valeth. I said very quietly, do you know the Veth command structure? She said yes. I said, do you know the unit designation of the team operating in this corridor tonight? She said, after a moment's thought, the 7th Detachment of the Veth Liberation Force. They use the marker V7. I said, when I open this hatch, I need you to address them. By designation, by rank if you know it, in Veth. Tell them the mission has failed. Tell them you are offering a terms of surrender negotiation, standard galactic protocol. Tell them you have authority to grant protected status pending tribunal. She looked at me. She said, that will make them pause. I said, 4 seconds. Maybe 5, she said. What do you need 5 seconds for? I said, to get inside the weapons range. Clara, behind us, made a very small sound that I chose not to interpret. Valeth looked at me for a long moment. Her bioluminescent markings pulsed once, slowly the way they did when she was thinking at full capacity. Then she said, "On your mark." I opened the hatch. She spoke. Her voice was absolute. Not loud, not harsh, but carrying the full weight of 200 years of imperial bloodline and 40 years of diplomatic training. She named the unit. She named the commander's rank. She spoke in Veth with the fluency of a native speaker. And in the first 3 words she had their attention completely. Because a Solhari princess speaking Veth with that kind of precision was not a thing that was supposed to exist. And the human brain, and the Veth brain, it turned out, takes slightly longer to process things that are not supposed to exist. 4 seconds, exactly 4. I was already inside the room. The team leader was tall, broader than the others I had encountered, and he moved fast when he understood what was happening. We hit the floor together. It was the worst of the engagements that night. He was skilled and he was strong, and he caught my cracked rib with his elbow on the way down, and the pain went white for a moment. But white is still light, and I could still function, and function was all that was required. His second, the one positioned on the other side of the door, had a clear line on me for most of it. He did not take it. I found out later it was because Valeth had stepped through the hatch behind me and placed herself directly in his line of sight, which made the shot impossible without hitting her. And even a Veth soldier in a failed operation does not make that choice lightly. It ended on the floor, ugly and final, the way all of them had ended. I stayed on my knees for a moment, breathing. The cracked rib was fully cracked now. I was fairly certain. There was a grating quality to the next 3 inhales that told me something had shifted. I breathed through it. The team leader's second put down his weapon. He put his hands up. Valeth told him in Veth to stay still. He stayed still. I got to my feet. I found the communications relay on the engineering wall. It was labeled, thankfully, in standard galactic notation, and I cut the power coupling on the jam relay with my field knife. The frequency that had been pressing against the edges of my hearing for the past 90 minutes went silent. The ship's communications came back online. Valeth moved to the communications panel. She entered the summit override codes from memory, a long sequence, no hesitation, every character placed precisely. The signal went out to the transit corridor. From the bridge, Commander Ross's voice came through the internal intercom almost immediately. Communications restored. Summit ships responding. Situation? I looked at Valeth. She looked at me. She pressed the intercom and said, calmly and clearly, "Situation resolved, Commander. Send medical to engineering, Deck 2, and prepare a formal incident report. We will need it for the summit." She released the intercom. She looked at me. I said, "You stepped into the line of fire." She said I was making a shot impossible. I said, "Yes." She said, "That is what you needed." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I did not think of it as courage. I thought of it as a function that needed performing." I said, "That's what courage usually is." She looked at me for a long moment with that recalibrating expression, the one I had first seen at the star map vendor on Keth Station, and then she crouched beside me, below me, which for a Solhari of her standing was not a small thing, and opened a medical kit that she had pulled from the emergency cabinet near the engineering entrance. She took out a thermal seal and pressed it to the cut on my forearm, holding it in place while the bonding compound set. I said, "You didn't have to," she said. "I am aware of what I didn't have to do. I am choosing what I will do." She pressed slightly firmer. "Hold still." I held still. The Vel Sareth reached Keth Arfi 7 hours later than scheduled. The summit opened with a procedural delay that the assembled diplomatic corps handled with varying degrees of patience. The Veth delegation, present at the summit under observer status, made no public statement about the incident. The Solhari legal team filed formal charges against the captured team members under galactic transit law. Delivered my commendation personally, in the formal Solhari style, standing very straight and speaking in a precise and carefully worded way that communicated professional respect without requiring him to revisit the conversation on Keth Station. I accepted it without making it difficult for him. People who do not listen are sometimes not given another chance to learn. Ross had been given one, and he understood that, and the commendation was part of how he was processing it. I respected the effort. The summit itself was everything the briefing notes had promised. Complex, political, and entirely above my clearance level. I stood at the edge of formal sessions in the correct position, watched the exits, and said nothing to anyone who did not address me first. The robe was gone. Nobody commented on its absence. The court, to a person, found reasons not to make eye contact with me directly, which was their way of processing a recalibration that hadn't finished yet. Valeth moved through the summit as she had moved through everything, with precision and composure, and the absolute authority of someone who has never once needed a room to be told who was in charge of it. She negotiated, she mediated, She sat in 16 hours of sessions over 4 days and emerged each evening looking as composed as she had entered, which was a kind of endurance I had genuine admiration for. On the third morning, Orvith found me at the edge of the summit hall's outer corridor and handed me a sealed document on a formal Solhari data chip. He said the princess had authorized its delivery, and that it was marked for my personal record. He said nothing else. He walked away. I opened it in my quarters. It was a formal diplomatic request, addressed to the Terran Orbital Command, filed through the Solhari Imperial Diplomatic Office, stamped with Valith's personal authorization seal. It requested the reclassification of the Terran escort role from ceremonial to protective advisory, effective immediately and retroactively. It included a formal testimony regarding the events of the past 4 days. It was 12 pages long and every word was precise. At the bottom, beneath the official language, there was a single additional line, handwritten in Terran Standard. The treaty clause has existed for 200 years without anyone asking what it was for. I have asked. This is my answer. I read it twice. I sat with it for a while. That evening, entering the 4th session of the summit, Valith walked past me in the outer corridor. She was moving at full diplomatic pace, with her court in motion around her, and she did not slow down. But as she passed, she shifted her position by exactly 2 steps to the left, moving me to her right side, which was the side with the clear sight line to both the main entrance and the secondary door behind the speaking platform. She had figured that out herself. I had not told her. She had observed it, assessed it, and made the adjustment, the same way she had adjusted everything else, without announcement, without ceremony, with complete quiet competence. I took the position on her right. She did not look at me as we walked into the hall. She did not need to. The adjustment said everything that needed to be said. 3 days later, the summit closed. The Vel Sereth was refueled and restocked, and the court settled back into the rhythms of the journey home. I resumed my place at night, on the floor, back to the wall, between the princess's door and the maintenance hatch. But now the hatch was sealed with a secondary lock I had installed myself, and the patrol rotations had been revised into something less predictable, and Commander Ross had stopped scheduling his sweeps in a pattern that anyone with a half-decent timeline could memorize. Small changes, the kind that don't announce themselves, the kind that last. On the 7th night of the return journey, Valith opened her door at 0300. She did not seem surprised to find me awake. She sat down across the corridor from me with her back against the opposite wall, the way I sat, and she looked at the ceiling for a moment. She said, "I have been thinking about what you said, about humans in a dangerous world." I said the galaxy doesn't know what that makes us. She said, "I know. I have been thinking about what it makes you." She paused. "My kind has not had a predator in 8,000 years. We evolved past the age of being prey so long ago that we built our entire civilization on the assumption of safety. Our security doctrine is designed to manage threats to that safety from the outside. Contain, classify, authorize response." She looked at me. "Yours is different," I said. "Yes," she said. "Yours is designed from the inside out. You start from the assumption that you are already in danger and build from there." I said, "Something like that." She was quiet for a moment. "It is more honest," she said. "As a foundation," I said. "It is also harder to live with." She said, "I know." I could see that. She looked down the corridor. "You were not afraid out there. I watched you very carefully. You were not afraid." I said, "I was afraid." She looked at me. I said, "I am always afraid. That is not the same as being controlled by it." I thought about how to explain it. Fear is information. It tells you what matters. What I do with it is a different question. She processed that. Then she said, "In Solhari we have a word for a person who manages fear in that way. It translates roughly as, one who stands on the edge and does not fall." I said, "That's not bad." She said, "It was always an abstract concept. I had never seen it in practice until 5 days ago." I did not answer that. There are things that don't need an answer. We sat in silence for a while. The comfortable kind. The kind that means something has been settled without needing to be said. The ship hummed around us. The stars outside were the long pale lines of corridor transit, steady and endless. Eventually Valith stood. She looked down at me. She said, "When we reach Terran space and you are reassigned, will you tell me where?" I said, "If I can." She said, "I ask because I intend to submit a second request. A standing request this time. For a specific protective advisory officer." I looked up at her. She held my gaze without expression. That still composed, precise expression that I had spent 11 days learning to read past. I said, "I'll let you know where they send me." She said, "Good." And she went back through her door and it closed behind her with a soft and final sound. I leaned my head back against the wall. The corridor was empty and quiet. The maintenance hatch on my left was locked from both sides. The patrol rotation was unpredictable now. Everything was safer than it had been. I closed my eyes. Not to sleep, not deeply, not in a space I had not fully trusted yet, but to rest. And I thought about what Colonel Price was going to say when he read the amendment. I thought about what the galaxy had spent 200 years assuming about the treaty clause. I thought about a princess who had moved 2 steps to the left, so a human soldier had a better sightline. One adjustment at a time. That is how things change. I settled against the wall and let the ship carry us home.